When is it okay to say that you don't care if little children get killed because his people are all crazy and probably going to grow up to be terrorists anyway? My name is Chris and I used to be a content moderator for Facebook. Today we're going to look and see what Facebook's Oversight board says about questions like this one. Now, before we can look at this case, we need to go back in time about 10 years just to get some background information. In 2012, a magazine in France called Charlie Hebdo published some cartoons which made fun of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, I've seen the cartoons. They're not very funny, they're not very clever. In fact, some of them are basically hate speech. But they were published anyway, and a lot of people in France were quite outraged by this. About 10% of the population in France are Muslims, and from among that community, 2 young men eventually went to the Charlie Hebdo office in 2015, and they just started shooting people. They killed 4 or 5 people, I think, at the Charlie Hebdo office. So obviously this is a really big deal in France. Now, in October of 2020, a school teacher named Samuel Paty was teaching a class on citizenship, and he was talking about the idea of freedom of speech, civic discourse, and he wanted the class to talk about the cartoons and the killings at the Charlie Hebdo office. And some of the students didn't like this. One of them went home, complained to their parents about what had happened. The parents went off to complain within their community, and a few days later a Muslim man appeared at the high school where Samuel Paty worked and killed him, cut his head off with a knife. It was a terrible, brutal terrorist incident which was all in the news in October of 2020, which is when this case first started. So what exactly happened in this case? Well, it's not totally clear because it all was in the Burmese language, which I can't read. So we're relying on translators to tell us what happened. But what's clear is that somebody posted an image which is quite disturbing, and we're going to put it up here on this side. But if you don't want to see pictures of dead babies, then this would be a good moment to close your eyes. Now, the picture features a little boy who died in Turkey in 2015. And he was part of a refugee family. They were trying to escape from the fighting in Syria and get to Europe. And of course, the Europeans don't want more and more Muslim refugees coming to Europe. So there's a big debate about Western attitudes towards Muslim people. And this user apparently posted that they didn't have any sympathy for this little boy because Muslims are all crazy or deranged, something wrong with their brains, and anyway, he's probably going to grow up to be a terrorist. So the post goes on to explain that, and I'll quote here from the Facebook translation, "Indeed, something's wrong with Muslims psychologically." So that means there's something inside the head that is wrong with Muslim people. As I said, he claimed that the little boy was then going to grow up to be a terrorist. It also said, "I have no sympathy for him because of the events in France." So what he's doing there is he's saying that all Muslims are the same and all Muslims are responsible for the actions of just one individual. And Facebook deleted this post because for them this counts as hate speech. So let's briefly just remind ourselves again, what is hate speech? So the core concept when we talk about hate speech is this idea of a protected category. And a protected category is anything really that's central to your identity or who you are or the group that you belong to. So your religion, your ethnicity, your nationality, your gender, your sexual orientation, this kind of thing. And if you say that all members of that category, they all share a characteristic, well, you'd better be really careful that that's a positive characteristic. Because hate speech is any kind of attack or derogatory statement about somebody because they're a member of a protected category. So in this case, saying that all Muslims are the same, well, that's already a sweeping generalization. You're into hate speech territory. And then you say, well, they're all responsible for this bad thing, or they all have this psychological problem. Well, that's hate speech, according to Facebook. And so they've deleted it. Now, the Oversight Board asked Facebook why they've deleted it. They've asked for detail, and Facebook went back to the moderators or to their own experts and asked for a translation of the Burmese text so that they could justify the decision. And the translation was, "It's indeed something's wrong with Muslims psychologically." Basically saying that the brain doesn't work properly if you're a Muslim. So that, for me, that sounds like a hate speech. That's an attack on somebody. It's a statement of inferiority. Now, the board had their own translators. They asked somebody else to tell them what they thought the Burmese text said. And the translation that they came back with was a bit different. It says, "Those male Muslims have something wrong with their mindset." And mindset is not psychology. It's not the wiring of your brain. It's the decisions that you've made or the education that you've received. And that's not really an attack on somebody because of their protected characteristic. It's probably not hate speech. So we're in this really difficult decision now where we have to choose, who do you believe? Because it all hinges on whether the translation is accurate or not. Now, this question of translation is just one of several issues that I have with the way this case was examined. And we'll start just with the timeline. Now, the original post was made on the 29th of October 2020. All good. On the 3rd of November, Facebook apparently marked it as disturbing because it contains a graphic image of a dead baby. So, okay, that makes sense. But that wasn't done automatically. It was done 5 days later. So probably somebody reported it and it was reviewed by a moderator. And then it was deleted another time, some days later. We don't know the date for that. And I think that information should have been public because it's important. It means that probably 2 different people have reviewed the same piece of content, or it's been reviewed at least twice anyway. And they've made a different decision each time. The first time around, they didn't delete it for hate speech, and the second time they did. So there's obviously a little bit of ambiguity here about what's going on. This issue of consistency in content moderation is the key problem that we're facing here. We always want the content moderators to always make the same decision, and they do that by applying a very, very detailed set of rules. We call them the implementation standards, and they're different from the community standards that are publicly viewable. But the board keeps talking about the community standards say this, and they don't refer to whether the content moderator followed the detailed rules. And this is a really important point that I hope they'll pay more attention to. And then the next question is this translation issue. What did the guy really say? Well, I don't know. But I do know one thing. I've worked in a Facebook content moderation office with Burmese people. They seem to be competent, well-meaning people. They seem to know how to do their jobs properly. And I'm a little bit concerned that the board has just gone running off to find somebody else to prove that they didn't do their job properly. It's a little bit suspect to me. Obviously, if you go to somebody and say, why did you make this decision? They're going to translate the text in a way that justifies what they've done. Fair enough. But what if you then go to somebody else and say, hey, my job is to find fault with Facebook. I'm here to identify mistakes that they've made, and I need you to translate this text differently for me. Have a look. Tell me what you think. You're open to criticism here. I think the board needs to share publicly what are the terms of reference of the translators that they've spoken with. What exactly did you ask them to do? Because if you've asked them to justify taking a different decision, well, everything's always open to interpretation. So this is it's a bit messy. Another issue that the board has raised here is context. They keep talking about the wider picture. For example, they say here, the post on its own might appear to be making an offensive and insulting generalization about Muslims or Muslim men. The post should be read as a whole, considering context. Very good. And then later on, they go to say that generally in Myanmar, there was no indication that statements referring to Muslims as mentally unwell or psychologically unstable are a significant part of anti-Muslim rhetoric. Now, we don't care about context. I, as a content moderator, do not have the time and the energy to try and figure out who you are and what your bigger motivations are. I can only look at the post that's in front of me and judge it on its own merits. And that is something that's hammered into us in training. So you can't say the guy made the wrong decision here. You have to say he's been incorrectly trained and Facebook is not giving people enough flexibility in their decision making, for example. But if you give people flexibility, then they're going to not be consistent in their decisions. Now, to give you an example of this, I personally happened to be living in Turkey at the time that little boy died, and at the same time as the attacks at the Charlie Hebdo office in Paris. And I know a little bit about what some Muslims think about these events. I know a little bit about what some Muslims have to say about the way that Muslims are treated in China. But you can't expect every content moderator to have this specific experience, which enables them to maybe know a little bit more about this specific case. I would see every day in my work instances of stuff that I had no idea what was going on. I didn't know anything about it at all. Nobody can know everything. And in that case, nobody can know all of the relevant context. You can't do it. So we don't consider context. We consider what you said right there in front of me. So it just boils down to the translation. Who do we believe? The board also talks a lot about human rights, and they refer to the United Nations Charter on Human Rights quite specifically as they discuss this case and whether Facebook's policies and decisions are aligned with human rights. And that's all very good. But if you're the content moderator working on the day reviewing this specific post, you don't care about that. You don't think about that. What you care about is whether the post violates the detailed rules that you're being paid to enforce. So the board needs to separate policy, what the policy should be, from whether the individual implemented that policy correctly on the day. Because these are two very important and very different questions. And I don't think the board is making a clear separation between these two things. They're just treating Facebook as this one big monolithic organization, when in fact the work is done by a contractor employed by another company in an office that isn't even a Facebook office. So they really need to be a bit clearer about their thinking in these cases. While I'm complaining about the board, guys, you have weeks to discuss what's going on in each one of these cases. You have, 50 social scientists from around the world whose job is to help you consider the context of these cases. You have thousands, 3,500 country experts that you can rely on to help you determine what went on or what should have went on. The person who made the decision on the day had probably 30 seconds to make their decision and then move on to the next one. And they will have seen hundreds of comments like this on that day. And I don't think you can really compare those two situations. It's very well to say, with the benefit of all this time and expertise, that some guy under a lot of time pressure made a mistake, but you need to look at the bigger picture of what's going on there. So what was the final decision? Well, the board decided that they were going to go with their own translator's interpretation of the post. They were going to read it as mindset rather than psychology, which means that the original post was okay and Facebook's decision was wrong. So they were going to turn it around. Now, personally, I would believe that the people who've been doing this job for many years, their specialization is to understand what is hate speech and what isn't in their own language. I'm going to believe that they know what they're talking about. I'm going to believe with them, which means that the post was hate speech and it should have been deleted. Obviously, you might have your own opinion. You can put that opinion down there in the comments section. And while you're there, give us a like and a subscribe. And hopefully we'll see you in the next one. I'm going to go and start researching that. My name is Chris. This has been Oversight Examined, and we'll see you soon.